The face of Charles Whitman, the bank manager, turned pale as paper. His hands trembled as he reached for the phone on his desk. "Lock the front doors," he told his assistant, his voice dropping so low it seemed to freeze the room, "and call the police. Immediately." Then he looked up at me. That look, as if I had just placed a ticking grenade in his hands, not my grandfather's old savings passbook, belonging to a man who had passed away exactly 2 weeks earlier. That very passbook, my mother had tossed it straight into the trash just 1 day before, sneering as she did, "Worthless garbage. It should have been buried with him." She was certain it meant nothing. It turns out some secrets refuse to stay buried, and some secrets have claws. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Elise Thornton, 31 years old, and until that morning, I truly believed the most exciting part of my week was an ongoing argument with my landlord about the broken heater in my rental apartment in Anacostia. I work as a legal assistant at a small law firm in downtown Washington, D.C. The job isn't glamorous. The pay is just enough to get by. My 2012 Honda Civic wheezes like a dying whale every time I turn left. But I'm good at my job because I pay attention to details. I ask questions, and I don't let go until I get answers. My family has always considered that a character flaw. The funeral took place on a Tuesday. My grandfather, Henry Thornton, passed away at the age of 89. He lived on a modest farm in Frederick County, Maryland, about a 2-hour drive from D.C., the kind of place with a wraparound porch and fields stretching all the way to the horizon. Everyone assumed he had nothing left, just an old man in an old house, living out his final years in quiet simplicity. That was certainly what Veronica wanted everyone to believe. The service was efficient, restrained, and cold, perfectly in line with my mother's style. Veronica has always believed that emotions are a form of weakness, and funerals were no exception. She organized everything like a corporate event, 30 minutes for the ceremony, 45 minutes for light refreshments. Then everyone goes home. No lingering, no excessive tears. The food came from a catering company that clearly believed mayonnaise was its own food group. My grandmother would have risen from her grave just to complain about that potato salad. She had standards. Veronica did not. My brother Julian arrived 40 minutes late wearing a suit that cost more than my car. He said parking was difficult. The farm has a gravel lot the size of a football field. But sure, Julian. Parking was difficult. He showed almost no visible grief, which wasn't surprising. Julian had never been good at emotions that didn't offer a direct return. He hugged our mother, shook a few hands, and spent most of the reception staring at his phone, probably tracking investments. Julian loved talking about his investments. I hated hearing about them. I stood off to the side watching my family perform grief like a rehearsed play. And I thought about my grandfather. Henry Thornton was an accountant for 40 years. Numbers were his language. He could look at a spreadsheet and see stories others missed. He also played chess, and he was very good at it. He taught me how to play when I was 7. We sat on the porch, the chessboard between us, sweating glasses of lemonade beside us in the Maryland summer heat. I still remember the smell of dry grass, the sound of cicadas, and his rough hands as he showed me how to move a knight. "Chess isn't about how many pieces you capture," he used to say, his voice warm like aged honey. "It's about the positions you create, the traps you set, and the patience to wait for your opponent to make their own mistakes." His favorite saying was, "The truth is patient, little Elise. It can wait longer than any lie." I never understood that until now. 2 weeks before he died, I visited him at the farm. October, maple leaves turning red. Cool, clean air. I drove out from D.C. after work and arrived as dusk settled over the fields. Copper gold light streamed through his bedroom window, stretching across the old wool blanket. He was weak. His body was slowly leaving him. But his eyes, still sharp, focused, alive. as if his spirit were burning inside a house about to collapse. I sat beside his bed and held his hand. His skin was thin as rice paper, but still warm. The room smelled of medicine, mixed with the menthol oil he rubbed on himself every night. Suddenly, he squeezed my hand with a strength that startled me. He pulled me closer. His voice was barely more than breath, but every word was deliberate. "The savings passbook," he said, "in my study, hidden inside the chess book. Only you, Elise. Promise me." I promised. I didn't understand, but I promised. In that fading light, I didn't know it was his final instruction. I didn't know he was handing me the key to a battle that had lasted for years, a battle he couldn't win while he was alive. But he believed I would win it for him. After the funeral, the family gathered at the farm. Veronica immediately began moving from room to room, talking about selling the land, discussing potential buyers, calculating acreage, as if my grandfather's body hadn't even cooled yet. Julian nodded along, occasionally adding comments. They had clearly discussed this before, perhaps while he was still alive. I quietly slipped away and headed toward my grandfather's study. The room was small, lined with bookshelves, heavy with the scent of old paper and pipe tobacco. He had quit smoking 20 years ago, but the smell never left. I stood in the center of the room, closed my eyes, and breathed in. That smell alone was enough to tighten my throat. I spotted the chess book immediately. Strategic Endgames, a master's guide. His favorite. I pulled it from the shelf and felt something was wrong. It was heavier than it should have been. When I opened it, my heart nearly stopped. The pages had been hollowed out. Inside lay an old leather-bound savings passbook, the corners worn, an artifact from another era. My hands trembled as I held it. This was what he wanted me to find. I carried it into the living room, intending only to share the discovery with my family. That was my mistake. Veronica saw it before I could say a word. Her reaction was immediate. Too fast, too sharp. She crossed the room in 3 strides, yanked the passbook from my hands without even looking at it, and threw it straight into the kitchen trash. "Garbage," she said coldly. "An old account that probably doesn't even exist anymore. That thing should have been buried with him. Stop digging through his belongings, Elise. It's inappropriate." Julian laughed from the couch. "Always so sentimental, aren't you?" They exchanged a look. Just a moment, brief, almost invisible, but I saw it. 8 years in the legal field had taught me to recognize that look, the look of people sharing a secret, the look of fear, when someone gets too close to something they want buried. And in that moment, standing in the living room where I once played chess with my grandfather, I knew something was very wrong. That passbook mattered. And Veronica was afraid of it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my small Anacostia apartment, staring at the ceiling. Streetlights filtered through the blinds, painting pale orange lines across the wall. Outside, cars passed now and then. Someone laughed loudly on the street, but my mind was roaring. If the passbook was worthless, why was my mother angry? Why not indifferent? Why throw it away so quickly, so forcefully? And I thought about my grandfather, his sharp eyes, his deliberate instructions. He had been an accountant for 40 years. He didn't confuse paperwork or numbers. If he hid that passbook inside a hollowed-out chess book and told only me, there was a reason. People only get angry when they have something to hide. At 5 a.m, I made my decision. I would go back to the farm. The passbook was still in the trash. And I would find out why my mother wanted it buried so badly. The drive took 2 hours in the gray light before dawn. I turned off the radio. I needed to think. My grandfather was patient. Methodical. Strategic. He tracked numbers for 40 years, spotted discrepancies, documented everything. He played chess like someone who could see 15 moves ahead. He never did anything randomly. And my mother never threw anything away with that kind of aggression unless she was afraid. When I arrived, the first light was breaking over the eastern sky. The fields glowed purple and gold. No cars, no people. Perfect. I unlocked the door with the spare key hidden beneath the third porch step. The house was silent, as if holding its breath. I went straight to the kitchen. The trash bag was still there. I pulled it out, set it on the floor, and started digging. A grown woman, college-educated, elbows deep in garbage at 5:30 in the morning, like a raccoon in business attire. My grandfather would have been proud. My therapist would have had many questions. The passbook was near the bottom, beneath coffee grounds and napkins from the funeral. I pulled it out, wiped it clean on my sleeve, and examined it closely for the first time. The leather was old, but when I opened it, something didn't add up. The account number inside was too modern. The format was wrong. Too many digits. And then I saw the note. Tucked into the spine of the passbook, folded into a small square, was my grandfather's familiar handwriting. Account number 77412289. They don't know about this. Request the full history. Don't trust anyone in the family. Only you, Elise. I read it 3 times. My heart pounded painfully against my ribs. They meant Veronica. It meant Julian. My grandfather had hidden a secret from his own family, and he trusted only me to uncover it. I photographed everything. The passbook, the note, the account number. I uploaded it all to the cloud immediately. Documents can be destroyed. Records can disappear. Digital copies last forever. I drove back to D.C., the passbook in my bag, my mind burning with questions. The first call came at 10 in the morning. Veronica. Her voice was sweet, concerned, maternal, everything she was not. Just checking on you after yesterday, she said. It was a hard day. I waited. Then she asked exactly what I expected. You didn't take anything from the farm, did you? Everything belongs to the estate now. We need to inventory before selling. I lied smoothly. I just took one of Grandpa's chess books as a keepsake. A pause. I could hear calculation in her breathing. Then her voice softened. Good. And don't dig through his things anymore, Elise. Some things are better left alone. Your grandfather wasn't clear-minded in his final years. He couldn't always tell what was real. I said nothing. Inside, I was screaming. 2 weeks ago, he had looked me straight in the eyes and given precise instructions. That was not confusion. That was a man with a plan. The second call came at 7 in the evening. Julian, my brother, the one who hadn't reached out in 6 months. He called to check in, like a cat volunteering to do your taxes. The last time Julian had called me unprompted was 3 years ago to ask if I still had Dad's golf clubs. I did. He took them. I never saw them again. Some patterns are easy to recognize. Hey, Elise, he said, overly friendly. Mom said you were asking about Grandpa's stuff. Just wanted to make sure you're okay. I'm fine, I replied. Then he guided the conversation. Grandpa didn't have much. The farm, a few belongings. Mom will handle the money. I'll take care of the assets. You don't need to worry about anything. And there it was. Veronica gets the money. Julian gets the property. Elise gets nothing. They thought I would accept it. They thought I wouldn't ask questions. Just let it go, Julian said before hanging up. You know, Mom, it's not worth fighting. I sat in my apartment, thinking about the timing. Veronica called at 10. Julian called at 7, 9 hours apart, almost coordinated, almost a test. They were afraid of something. I documented everything, every call, every timestamp, every word. I looked at the savings passbook again. At the note, at the account number too modern for the worn leather. Tomorrow I would take the day off. I would go to the bank. I would find out what my grandfather had hidden. And whatever my mother was desperate to bury, I would drag it into the light. I had no idea that when I walked into that bank the next morning, everything I believed about my family would collapse completely, and the savings passbook I pulled from the bottom of a trash can would become the evidence that exposed an entire web of lies. I took a day off work, and my boss approved it with very few questions. One of the benefits of almost never taking time off is that when you finally do, no one feels like arguing. The drive to the bank took exactly 2 hours. First Regional Savings had been acquired by a larger institution years ago, but the main branch still operated in Bethesda, Maryland, a small town with one traffic light and a diner that I swear has been serving the same coffee since 1972. I walked into the bank at 9:15 in the morning. In my bag, I had the savings passbook, my identification, my grandfather's death certificate, and documents proving I was a family member. I didn't expect much. Maybe a few $100s in a forgotten account. Maybe just an explanation. Something to tell me why he had warned me the way he did. The young teller at the counter smiled when I approached. She took the passbook, glanced through it with polite curiosity, then typed the account number into her computer. And in that exact moment, her smile faded. She excused herself and stepped into the back. I saw her make a phone call, speaking in a voice so low I couldn't hear the words. 20 minutes passed. I sat in the waiting area, watching the clock, starting to feel foolish. Maybe Veronica was right. Maybe this passbook was nothing. Maybe I had just driven 2 hours to be told the account is empty, and then return home with quiet embarrassment. I sat there long enough that I accidentally learned the entire life story of the security guard. His name was Carl. He was training for a 5-kilometer race, and his wife had made him give up bread. I had never seen anyone look so sad while standing only 3 steps away from a bowl of free mint candies. At that point, one very clear thought formed in my mind. If this really was a meaningless passbook, then what exactly were they reacting to? A teller, a secret phone call, 20 minutes of waiting. No one spoke to me. No one explained anything. And suddenly, I remembered one thing very clearly. Veronica had thrown this passbook into the trash, the way someone throws away evidence. Not the way someone throws away an old object. I told myself, calm down, Elise, don't scare yourself. But my heart refused to listen. Then a man in an expensive suit appeared in the lobby. He was tall, gray at the temples, with the perfectly neutral face of someone who had spent a lifetime training himself not to show emotion. He introduced himself as Charles Whitman, Regional Director. He studied me for a second, the kind of look that was part evaluation, part caution, then said, politely but firmly, "Miss Thornton, please come with me. We'll speak in my private office." His office smelled of polished wood and old paperwork. Light filtered through striped blinds, casting long lines across the dark green carpet. Degrees hung in oak frames on the wall, along with a family photograph. Whitman, younger, standing beside his wife and 2 children. His hands trembled slightly as he took the savings passbook from me. He examined it slowly, carefully, as if it might explode. Then he sank heavily into his leather chair and let out a long breath. "Ms. Thornton," he said, his voice measured and cautious, "this account has been flagged in our system." My stomach dropped immediately. "Flagged," I repeated. That word is never a good sign. But he shook his head as if to reassure me. "Not because of anything you've done, but because of its history." Then he explained step by step, very clearly. This account did not date back to 1962, despite what the antique passbook suggested. It was opened in the year 2010. My grandfather had deliberately used a vintage passbook as camouflage to hide this account from eyes that should not see it. This was a compound interest savings instrument, and it had not been touched for 14 years. The current balance was... Whitman did not say it aloud at first. He picked up a pen, wrote a number on a piece of paper, and slid it across the desk. $2,147,832. When I saw the number, I made a sound that I can only describe as the sound of someone accidentally sitting on a cat. Part gasp, part groan, and part immediate need to lie down. Whitman handed me a glass of water. I took it, but honestly, I needed something stronger. $2 million. My grandfather, the man everyone believed had nothing, who lived on a modest farm and wore the same 3 sweaters for 20 years, had a massive sum of money hidden in an account no one knew about, but Whitman wasn't celebrating with me. If anything, his expression grew more troubled, as if that number was only the surface of a much larger problem. "There's more," he said, his voice dropping noticeably. "In the year 2015, someone attempted to access this account." He looked directly into my eyes before continuing. "They came with power of attorney documents for Henry Thornton. They presented what appeared to be his signature authorizing transfers." He paused for exactly 1 beat, the kind that makes your scalp go cold. But our verification system flagged inconsistencies. The signature did not fully match the records. Access was denied, and the attempt was logged in our security system. My mouth went dry. "Who?" I asked, even though the answer was already forming in my mind. Whitman lowered his eyes to the paperwork. "The individual who attempted access is listed as Veronica Thornton." He looked up again and asked carefully, "Is that a relative of yours?" I swallowed. "My mother." The 2 words fell, heavy as stone. My mother had tried to steal this money 9 years ago. She failed, but she tried. Whitman made additional calls. More people entered the room, a woman from security and a man from legal. They pulled records from archival storage and cross-checked them with other banks where my grandfather had held accounts. And the picture that emerged was so devastating that I had to clench my hands to keep them from shaking. My grandfather had money, significant money, an inheritance from his parents in 1995, carefully invested and grown over the years. By 2009, when my father died and Veronica became his caretaker, he had accumulated over $1 million, spread across multiple accounts. Veronica found them, and over 5 years, from 2010 to 2015, she drained them, transfer by transfer, withdrawal by withdrawal, using power of attorney documents and signatures that looked legitimate but weren't. She stole approximately $1.5 million from my grandfather, but Henry Thornton was an accountant. He noticed. He couldn't stop her through legal channels because Veronica had convinced the court that he lacked mental capacity. He couldn't go to the police because no one believed an elderly man labeled confused over a devoted daughter-in-law. He was trapped, so he did the only thing left to him. He hid what remained. In 2010, when he realized what was happening, he secretly opened this account, transferred $1 million into it, used an old savings passbook as camouflage, and told no one. This account was his lifeboat, his insurance policy, his final move in a chess match against the woman who had stolen everything else from him. Whitman looked at me with something close to respect. "There's one more thing you should know," he said. "In 2019, your grandfather filed a formal complaint with our fraud department." He paused, choosing his words carefully. He stated that his daughter-in-law was stealing from him. He said no one believed him because he had been declared mentally incompetent. Then Whitman continued, slower and heavier. "We couldn't proceed without the original account documentation. No proof that he had assets she wasn't authorized to access without this." He lifted the savings passbook. "Your grandfather was trying to prove he was being robbed. And now, you've brought us the evidence he couldn't provide while he was alive." I sat there in that leather chair, hands clenched, and finally, I understood. My grandfather did not give up. He did not surrender to confusion or despair. He spent 9 years building a case, preparing evidence, waiting for the right moment, and he left the key with the only person he trusted to finish what he started. Me. Whitman reached for the phone. "Ms. Thornton," he said, "I need to contact our security division, and I believe law enforcement will need to be involved. This account is evidence of serious financial crime." I nodded slowly. I came here expecting nothing. Maybe a few $100s, maybe closure. Instead, what I found was $2,147,832 and proof that my mother was a thief. And somewhere I was absolutely certain my grandfather was smiling. My hands trembled as I left Whitman's office. Outside, the Bethesda sun was blazing, but I felt cold. I had just opened a door that could never be closed, and what lay behind it would destroy my family. But I had promised him. In the fading light 2 weeks earlier, I had promised, and Elise Thornton does not break her promises. The police arrived at the bank less than 2 hours after Charles Whitman's call. 2 detectives from the Financial Crimes Unit walked in, both carrying notebooks and that very familiar look, the expression of people who have seen this kind of thing far too many times. They called it elder financial abuse, one of the fastest-growing crimes in the United States, and the perpetrator is almost always family. The lead detective was Anika Moore, over 40, sharp-eyed, decisive, no nonsense. She had worked financial crimes for 15 years, and she told me something I would never forget. "These cases break my heart every time," she said, her voice gentle but firm. Because the victims are trapped. They depend on the very people stealing from them. They love the people hurting them, and when they try to speak up, no one believes them. She looked down at the savings passbook in my hands. "Your grandfather fought the only way he could," she continued. "With documentation, with evidence, with patience. He knew he wouldn't live long enough to see justice, but he believed you would do it for him." Those words made me cry right there in the Bethesda bank lobby. Not sobs, just tears I couldn't stop. After that, the investigation moved quickly. Whitman provided the full bank records. The 2015 access attempt was documented in detail. The forged signature, the fraudulent power of attorney paperwork, and the security system that had stopped the transfer in time. Everything was still there, preserved in the digital system, like a fly trapped in amber. But that was only the beginning. 3 days after my trip to the bank, I received a phone call that changed the entire landscape. The voice on the other end was old but steady. He introduced himself as Lionel Graves, an attorney 75 years old, and Henry Thornton's friend for more than 40 years. "Your grandfather left me very specific instructions," he said. "If he passed away, I was to contact you. Only you. No one else in the family." He was very clear. That afternoon, I drove to his office. It was a small office in a quiet part of Frederick, the kind of place where lawyers still keep wooden bookshelves, framed degrees from decades ago, and the smell of old paper mixed with coffee brewed in the morning. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the windows, laying warm, golden streaks across the brown carpet. Graves met me at the door. He was tall, slightly hunched with age, but his handshake was firm. His eyes were kind. "Henry and I played chess for 40 years, he said as he led me inside. He was the most methodical man I've ever known. When he came to me in 2020 and told me what was happening, I believed him immediately. He set a thick folder on the table between us. "Henry never made accusations lightly," Graves continued, "and he never came empty-handed." I opened the folder. My hands were shaking. Inside was everything. Copies of forged power of attorney documents placed beside my grandfather's real signature. The differences were subtle, but obvious if you knew how to look. The strokes were too rounded, the pen pressure too even. My mother had traced his signature, likely from documents she had access to, and she had done well enough to fool most people, but not well enough to fool the bank's verification system, and not well enough to fool an accountant who had spent 40 years spotting discrepancies. There were bank statements, transaction histories, and a handwritten journal, page after page, recording every suspicious withdrawal, every unauthorized transfer, every lie Veronica used to cover her tracks, dates, amounts, account numbers. 4 years of meticulous, almost obsessive record-keeping. and at the bottom of the folder, in a sealed envelope, was a notarized statement dated 2022. I opened it and read slowly. My grandfather's voice echoed in my head with every line. My name is Henry Thornton. I am fully sound of mind as I write this statement. My daughter-in-law, Veronica Thornton, took control of my finances after my son died in 2009. She convinced doctors that I was showing signs of dementia when I was not. She isolated me from the outside world, controlling my phone, visitors, and access to information. While pretending to be a devoted caregiver, she has been systematically stealing from me. I know exactly what is happening. I am an accountant. I spent 40 years tracking numbers, finding discrepancies, detecting fraud. Did she truly think I wouldn't notice my own money disappearing? But I am trapped. She has legal authority. She has made people believe I am losing my mind. Every time I try to resist, she tightens her control. Every time I speak up, she silences me. So I do what I do best. I document, I prepare, I wait. The final lines struck straight into my chest. I leave this evidence to my granddaughter, Elise, because she is the only one who will do the right thing. She always asks the questions others are afraid to ask. She visits me because she wants to, not because she expects anything. She plays chess with me because she loves the game, not because of inheritance. That is why I chose her. I love you, Elise. Be brave. I sat in Lionel Graves' office and let the tears fall. It wasn't exactly grief. It was something deeper, pride, mixed with pain for all the years he had lived alone with the truth. In a family where I always felt like an outsider, my grandfather had truly seen me, and he trusted me, with the most important thing he had left, not just money, justice. Graves handed me a box of tissues and patiently waited for me to steady myself. Then he said very softly, "There's one more thing you should know about your brother." The moment he said Julian's name, I knew this wasn't over. It wasn't just my mother. It wasn't just one manipulator. It was a plot, with more people involved than I ever imagined. The next day, Detective Moore called me. Her voice was more serious than before. "We've traced the money," she said, "where the stolen funds went after they left your grandfather's accounts." Then she paused for a beat. "And we found something very notable about your brother, Julian." Julian. The golden child, the expensive suits, the flashy investment portfolio, the arrogant confidence that he was always above everyone else. "He didn't just receive money from your mother," Moore continued. "He set up a shell company, Thornton Holdings, LLC, registered under his middle name. More than $600,000 was laundered through that company over 5 years. Her voice turned cold. "Your brother is not an innocent beneficiary. He is an active participant in the scheme. My brother, the one who told me to let it go, the one who laughed at me for being sentimental, the one who built his entire life on money stolen from our own grandfather, his house, his car, his investments. All of it was stolen money, hidden behind corporate paperwork and family lies. But the revelations didn't stop there. Moore's team ran background checks on everyone involved, a standard procedure. And they found something that explained everything. In 2002, Veronica's biological mother died. She left behind about $200,000 in savings. When the estate was settled, almost nothing remained. Some relatives suspected something, but they couldn't prove it. The money simply vanished. Veronica had done this before, to her own mother, 20 years before she did it to Henry Thornton, and my grandfather had known. That was why he never trusted her. That was why he was meticulous, patient, and prepared for years. He saw the pattern. He knew what she was capable of. And he spent the final 9 years of his life making sure she would not get away with it one more time. When Graves told me that, a cold feeling spread through my body. This wasn't a crime of desperation. This was a pattern, a loop of manipulation, theft, and betrayal. and my grandfather fought to his last breath to break it. Detective Anika Moore asked me to cooperate fully with the investigation. That meant one thing: silence. No warning my mother, no confronting my brother. Still showing up to family dinners, sitting at the same table, smiling at the right moments, nodding in the right places, and pretending everything was normal, while a criminal case was being built around them. "We need time to gather everything," she explained during a meeting at police headquarters. "Bank records, legal documents, witness statements. If they know we're investigating, they could destroy evidence, move assets, or flee." Then she looked me straight in the eyes. "I know this will be very hard," she said slowly, "but you have to trust the process. Your grandfather waited 9 years. We can wait 2 more weeks." I nodded, but inside I was shaking. 2 weeks of lying. 2 weeks of sitting across from the people who had stolen from my grandfather, who had smiled at his funeral, then divided his estate like vultures picking at a carcass. 2 weeks in hell. The first Sunday dinner at Veronica's house was pure torture. My mother's house sat in Potomac, a wealthy suburb outside D.C. colonial style. 4 bedrooms, a perfectly manicured backyard. And now I knew every brick in it smelled like my grandfather's money. I arrived at 6 o'clock carrying a bottle of wine and a stomach full of anxiety. Veronica opened the door with a warm smile, the smile she used for guests, for church committees, for people who didn't know who she really was. "Elise, sweetheart, come in." "Julian's already here." The smell of roasted chicken filled the house. My mother's chicken had always been a crime against poultry, dry as sandpaper and salty enough that you could hear the salt crunching between your teeth. But that night, it felt strangely appropriate. I was chewing terrible food while sitting across from a woman who had turned terrible decisions into an entire career. Julian lounged on the sofa, a glass of whiskey in his hand, eyes glued to financial news. He wore khakis and a short-sleeved button-down, the relaxed version of his usual suit. But the Rolex still gleamed on his wrist. Julian never relaxed away from the need to show off. "Hey, little sister," he said without looking up. "How was your week?" I sat down, forcing my hands not to shake. "Fine," I said. "Busy with work." "Good, good." He took a sip of whiskey. "Mom and I finalized everything for selling the farm. The buyer's closing at the end of the month. Good price. Grandpa would be happy." He would be disgusted, I thought. But I smiled. I nodded, like a supporting actor trying to play her part. Dinner unfolded like a carefully staged performance. Veronica sat at the head of the table. Julian on her right, me on her left. Candlelight, fine china, polished silverware. And in my mind, one thought kept pounding like a hammer. All of this was probably bought with his money, too. Veronica clasped her hands in prayer before the meal, her tone so solemn you could imagine her standing at a church pulpit. "Lord, we thank you for this meal and for our family. Especially tonight, we remember Henry, a kind man, a wonderful father. He would want us to stay united during this time, to support one another." I had to bite my cheek until it hurt to keep from screaming. A kind man she had stolen from. A wonderful father she had isolated, silenced, and turned into prey. Julian said amen and reached for the chicken as if he had just completed a genuine moral ritual. Throughout dinner, they talked about selling the farm, details, timelines, paperwork, as casually as planning to change the curtains. "The buyers want to keep some of the furniture," Veronica said, slicing the chicken into neat, precise pieces like someone cutting something else entirely. "The dining table, the oak cabinet in the living room, I think we should let them have it. We don't need it." "Agreed," Julian said. "Keep a few sentimental items. Let them handle the rest." I thought about that dining table. My grandfather and I used to sit there every time I visited, playing chess after dinner. I remembered the grain of the wood under my hands, the small scratch near the corner, where I dropped a rook when I was 8. Now, it was about to belong to strangers, just because Veronica and Julian decided it wasn't valuable enough. Inside my head, a relentless monologue ran. They're talking about assets as if they have a right, as if they didn't steal every cent, as if they didn't steal an entire life. Veronica smiled, her voice sweet as honey. But now I could see clearly the calculation behind her eyes, the way she measured every word, controlled every beat of the conversation. Julian occasionally glanced at his phone beneath the table, probably tracking the stock market, fueled by blood and lies, and I sat there, chewing dry chicken, nodding at the right moments, pretending I didn't know. Veronica turned to me. "Are you okay, Elise? You're quiet tonight." I pulled on a smile. "I'm just tired. Long week." "You work too hard," she said, her voice full of fake concern. "You need to take care of yourself. Grandpa always worried about you, you know. He said you worked too much and didn't make time for yourself." Hot tears burned behind my eyes. He worried about me while she was stealing from him. "I miss him," I said, my voice tight. "We all do," Veronica replied, placing her hand over mine. Soft, warm, and hollow. "But we have to move on. He would want that." After dinner, while I was helping wash dishes, Veronica pulled me aside. "Elise, sweetheart," she said softly, as if sharing a secret. "I know the past few years have been hard, since your father passed. And now Grandpa." She paused, watching my reaction. "I just want you to know, we're family. No matter what happens, we have each other. And I'll always take care of you." Every word was a lie wrapped in honey. I thought of my grandfather, alone on that farm, knowing his daughter-in-law was draining him dry but unable to stop it. How exactly had she taken care of him? Like an asset to be exploited. "Thank you, Mom," I said. My voice was flatter than I intended. Something flickered across Veronica's face, a tiny crease. She sensed the distance in me. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked. "Yes," I said quickly. "Just tired." But when I drove back to my apartment in Anacostia that night, my hands shook on the steering wheel. I was close to slipping, and I wondered, could I really survive 2 weeks like this? The second Sunday dinner was worse. This time, Julian brought his wife, Simone. Elegant, wearing expensive jewelry, with a smile as cold as glass. She worked in investment banking. Of course she did. Perfect for Julian. They talked about an upcoming vacation, Bermuda, a luxury resort. "We deserve a break after these stressful months," Julian said, his arm around Simone. "Losing Grandpa, handling the estate, it takes a toll." I stared down at my plate, biting my tongue until I tasted blood. That vacation, paid for with stolen money. After stressful months of counting money they never earned. Veronica raised her champagne glass. "A toast to family," she said. "To strength, to unity, to the future." Everyone lifted their glasses. Mine trembled slightly, and in that moment, looking across the table at those self-satisfied faces, so certain they had gotten away with it, I felt something inside me harden. They thought they had won. They had divided the spoils. They were planning vacations. They didn't know the walls were closing in. That night, driving away from Potomac, I signaled and turned onto the road and suddenly realized something that dried my throat. I no longer saw Veronica as my mother, and I no longer saw Julian as my brother. For those 2 weeks, they were just 2 names in an investigative file. And I was the only one sitting between them, playing the good daughter while also being the most critical witness. One wrong word, 1 second too long of a stare, 1 moment of shaking hands at the wrong time, everything would collapse. On Wednesday evening, Detective Moore called me. "We're ready," she said. "The arrest warrants have been approved. Friday morning, 7 a.m., simultaneous. I thought you'd want to know." I thanked her, hung up, and sat perfectly still in silence. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what was coming. My mother was about to lose everything. My brother was about to learn that betrayal has a price, and my grandfather's patience was finally about to be rewarded. I thought of his chess lesson. The truth is patient. It can wait longer than any lie. He sacrificed the final years of his life to set this trap. He knew he wouldn't live to see it close, but he knew I would. I imagined Veronica's face when the police appeared at her door. The calculation, the control, the perfect mask, all cracking. I imagined Julian being handcuffed in front of his colleagues. The arrogance and carefully built image of success dying in an instant. And strangely, I felt no triumph, only a very quiet sense of completion, like a book finally reaching its last chapter. I wasn't present when they were arrested. But Detective Moore told me everything afterward, and a small, dark part of me, one I'm not proud of, felt satisfied hearing it. Veronica opened the door. She was still in her bathrobe, a coffee mug in her hand. When she saw the badges and uniforms for a moment, her mask slipped. Moore said she looked like someone watching her world collapse in slow motion. The detectives presented the warrant, read the charges: fraud, forgery, elder financial abuse, theft. Veronica tried one final manipulation. Her voice was steady, reasonable, the voice of someone who had lied her way out of trouble her entire life. "This is a mistake," she said. "My father-in-law was mentally unstable. He didn't know what he was saying. I was only trying to protect him." Moore didn't flinch. "Ma'am," she replied coolly, professionally, "we have 4 years of documented evidence, a notarized statement from your father-in-law, witnessed by his attorney, bank records of your attempt to access an account you didn't know existed, and a paper trail showing exactly where the money went. This is not a mistake. This is consequence." Veronica Thornton was handcuffed and led to the police car. No screaming, no dramatics, just the quiet death of a 15-year lie. At the same time, across the city, Julian was sitting in his office. He was in a meeting with clients when officers walked in. Moore said he went pale. He tried to explain it away, tried to mention lawyers, tried to cling to the power he thought he had. But the officers weren't there to negotiate. Julian was handcuffed in the conference room in front of his colleagues. His reputation died in that moment. Anything he had built, any image he had polished, vanished instantly. You don't recover from being arrested for money laundering in your own boardroom. When Moore told me all of this, I sat in my small Anacostia apartment and felt something in my chest. Finally, loosen. The weight of the past 2 weeks, lying, pretending, sitting across from them at dinner while knowing everything, was finally lifted from my shoulders. My grandfather fought for 9 years. I fought for 2 weeks. And now, justice had arrived. The case moved through the court system over the following months. I attended multiple hearings, sitting on hard, cold wooden benches, watching the evidence presented piece by piece, stacked on top of one another like bricks, slowly forming an unbreakable wall. With each session, one thing became increasingly clear. My mother's confidence was cracking, not collapsing all at once, but fracturing little by little. As the prosecutors began to lay out the full scope of the case, when the money trails, documents, signatures, and stolen years were revealed in stark detail, the mask of control Veronica wore no longer held as firmly as before. Her lawyers tried every angle. They argued that Henry lacked mental capacity, and therefore his statements were invalid. The prosecution responded by calling 3 doctors who had examined and treated my grandfather over many years. All 3 testified to the same thing. Henry showed no signs of dementia. He was sharp, coherent, clear-minded, fully aware of reality. The earlier determination of incapacity, they explained, had been based on false information provided by Veronica herself. She had convinced the system that her father-in-law was confused, so that when he spoke out, no one would believe him. The judge was not sympathetic. Julian's lawyer tried a different approach. He requested a private meeting with me and arrived with an offer. We met in a small cafe near the federal courthouse. The attorney was a man in a three-piece suit, leather briefcase in hand, carrying the confidence of someone who measures time in billable hours. $400 an hour. "Julian wants to do the right thing," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "He's willing to testify against his mother in exchange for a reduced sentence. He says he was manipulated, that he didn't fully understand the seriousness of what was happening, that he, too, is a victim." I looked straight at him. This man wasn't speaking to me. He was selling me a story. "Julian says he wants to make things right," the lawyer continued. "He's ready to cooperate fully. He just needs a second chance." I thought for exactly 3 seconds. "Tell my brother," I said, my voice flat and cold, "that our grandfather taught me how to play chess. And in chess, you don't negotiate with pawns." I stood up, left my untouched coffee on the table, and walked out. It didn't matter anyway. The prosecutors didn't need Julian's cooperation. The shell company he created proved it clearly. He was not a passive beneficiary. He built the structure to hide stolen money. He signed documents. He executed transfers. He knew exactly where the money came from and helped conceal it anyway. There would be no deal, no leniency, full charges. There was a moment as I stepped out of the cafe that day when I stopped on the sidewalk and realized something strange. I was no longer angry, not because I had forgiven anyone, but because this had moved beyond the personal. This was no longer a family matter, no longer mother, daughter, brother. This was truth facing consequence. And once the wheels of justice begin to turn, they do not require emotion to keep moving. The sentencing hearing took place on a bitterly cold day in February. Federal courthouse, dark wood-paneled walls, the American flag hanging behind the judge's bench. Winter light streamed through tall windows, casting long streaks across the marble floor. I sat in the third row, hands clasped tightly in my lap. Detective Anika Moore sat beside me. Lionel Graves sat behind us, his elderly hand resting briefly on my shoulder once. No words, just a quiet gesture of support. Before sentencing, the prosecutor requested permission to read the victim impact statement, Henry's statement. The room fell silent as the female prosecutor's voice echoed, "My daughter-in-law stole my money and my dignity. She convinced the world that I was losing my mind while she drained my lifetime savings. No one believed me. I was not confused. I knew exactly what was being done to me, and I left records so that one day the truth would be revealed." I watched my mother as those words filled the courtroom. Veronica stared straight ahead, her face expressionless, but I saw her hands shaking. I saw the way her fingers clenched together, knuckles white. Julian didn't look at me. He stared down at the table, lips pressed into a thin line. He looked smaller than I remembered, as if the successful, arrogant man who once looked down on me had shrunk into a defeated figure. The judge read the sentences. "Veronica Thornton," his voice carried through the silent courtroom. 7 years in federal prison, no eligibility for early release. Full restitution ordered. All assets owned by the defendant will be liquidated and returned to the estate. 7 years, and everything she owned, the house in Potomac, the cars, the jewelry, the accounts, gone. Julian Thornton, 3 years in federal prison. A felony conviction that will follow you for the rest of your life. 3 years, and his investment career, professional reputation, carefully constructed image of success, finished. I sat there and felt something I hadn't expected. Not victory, not satisfaction. Just a quiet sense of completion, like closing a book, knowing it ended exactly where it should have. After the hearing, Detective Moore found me in the hallway. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said warmly. "He fought for years." "You finished it." I thanked her, shook her hand, and stepped out into the February cold. Later, Julian's lawyer called me again. He asked whether I would consider visiting my brother in prison. Said Julian wanted to apologize, wanted to explain. I told him I would think about it. 6 months have passed, and I am still thinking. Some apologies come too late to matter. Some explanations are not worth hearing. My phone buzzed. A message from Lionel Graves. Your grandfather left one more thing, a final item. When you're ready, come to my office. One more move from beyond the grave. Henry wasn't finished. I went to Graves's office 2 days after sentencing. It was still cold, but the sun was bright. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. Graves was waiting with hot tea and an envelope placed between us on the desk. My name, Elise, was written in my grandfather's familiar handwriting. He instructed me to give you this after everything was over, Graves said. He was very specific about the timing. He wanted you to read it when you could fully understand what it meant. The envelope was light, just paper, but I knew it carried something heavy. Before I opened it, Graves explained the legal outcome. The $2.1 million in the hidden account belonged to me. Henry's will, kept secure for many years, named me as the sole beneficiary. Veronica and Julian were explicitly excluded, with written explanations. The restitution process had begun. Seized assets would be liquidated. The proceeds from selling the farm, what my mother intended to keep, would be transferred to me. Total inheritance when everything was complete. Approximately $2.5 million. I nodded, but the money felt distant. What I truly wanted was inside the envelope. I opened it, 2 pages covered in my grandfather's familiar handwriting. The date showed 1 month before he died. My dearest Elise, if you are reading this letter, it means you found the savings passbook. You followed the trail. You did exactly what I believed you would do. I want you to understand why I chose you. Your brother was always his mother's son. I watched him grow up learning her values, taking shortcuts, believing the ends justify the means. I hoped he would change, but hope is not a strategy. An accountant knows better than to rely on hope. Your mother never loved me. She loved what I represented. Security, status, access to resources. When my son died, God rest his soul, she saw opportunity, an old man with money and no protection. She was wrong. Tears blurred my vision, but I kept reading. I knew what she was doing almost from the beginning. I am an accountant, Elise, 40 years of looking at numbers and finding discrepancies. Did she really think I wouldn't notice my own money disappearing? But I was trapped. She had legal authority. She convinced people I was losing my mind. Each time I resisted, she tightened her grip. So I did what I do best. I documented. I prepared. I waited. The truth is patient, Elise. It can wait longer than any lie. The tone softened. He apologized for the burden he left me. He apologized that I had to expose my own family. He knew it would hurt, but he knew I was strong enough to carry it. Live well. Use the money for something meaningful. Build something that lasts. Be happy. He fought a battle he could not win, but he made sure I would win it for him. Thank you for being the granddaughter I always hoped for. With all my love, Grandpa Henry. I sat in Lionel Graves's office and let the tears fall. Not tears of sadness, but something closer to healing. My grandfather had seen me, truly seen me. And he gave me the most important thing he had left, not just money, justice. 6 months have passed since the sentencing. I quit my job at the law firm, paid off all my debt, and bought a small building in downtown Washington, D.C., a narrow storefront with a large glass front flooded with natural light. I opened a bookstore. Not the kind of big chain with cold fluorescent lighting and lifeless discount tables, but the kind of place with comfortable chairs, the warm smell of coffee, and shelves filled with stories waiting to be discovered. The walls are painted a deep, cozy blue. The hardwood floors creak softly under every step. Green plants sit beside the windows, catching the morning sun. A place I know my grandfather would have loved. I named the bookstore Thornton Pages. Simple, real, unpretentious. He would have appreciated that modesty. In the back corner of the shop, I set up a chess table. 2 chairs. The board is always arranged, the pieces lined up neatly, as if the game is only paused. Sometimes customers sit down to play. Sometimes I sit with them. Above the table hangs a framed photo of my grandfather, an old one, him in a suit, smiling just slightly, eyes sharp but kind. Beside it is a simple wooden frame holding his favorite line, "The truth is patient. It can wait longer than any lie." My mother sometimes writes letters from prison, long letters, rambling, full of blame, justification, and carefully wrapped pleas for forgiveness, like counterfeit gifts. She says I betrayed the family. She says I destroyed everything. She says I owe her. The first letter arrived 2 weeks after she began her sentence. Prison paper, familiar handwriting but shakier than before. "Elise, you can't imagine how horrible this place is. These people, this is not where I belong. I tried to do the right thing. I tried to take care of your grandfather, but he didn't understand. He was old, confused, and now you've done this to your own mother. You owe me an explanation. You owe me a second chance." I read it once, folded it, put it in a drawer. I didn't respond. The second letter came a month later, then the third, then the fourth, each one more manipulative, more accusatory, trying harder to turn me into the cause of her collapse. They all went into the same drawer. Not reread, not answered. Some doors, once closed, should stay closed. Julian's wife divorced him. His friends disappeared. When he gets out, he will carry a felony conviction, and nothing left to prove the years of success built on stolen money. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that Simone filed for divorce before his sentence even began. She took the house, the car, and their joint accounts, whatever hadn't already been seized by the government. Julian lost his wife and his assets in one blow. His investment career? Dead. No firm hires a convicted money launderer. The reputation he spent years building, the golden boy, the brilliant investor, the brother who always knew better, completely dissolved. People who once had everything because they stole now have nothing. And me? I have a bookstore. I have peace. And I have the truth that my grandfather fought for years for justice. And I was the one who finished it. Every morning I open the shop at 9. Early sunlight pours through the glass, warming the wooden shelves. The smell of coffee from the small machine behind the counter, the quiet sound of the city waking up outside. I brew coffee, arrange books, sit down at the chess table with a hot cup, looking at the pieces. Sometimes I feel like he's there, not as a ghost, not anything supernatural, just a presence. In the books he would have liked, in the chessboard we used to play on, in the lessons he taught me about patience, strategy, and never giving up on the truth. One morning, an older man walked into the bookstore. Silver hair, a sweater, thin-framed glasses. He browsed for a while, then spotted the chess table. "Mind if I play a game?" he asked. "Please," I said. We played in silence for a while. He played solidly, each move careful, thinking a few steps ahead. He reminded me of my grandfather. "Who taught you to play?" he asked after a few moves. "My grandfather," I said. "He taught me when I was 7. He said chess is about patience, about waiting for the right moment." The man nodded and smiled. "He sounds like a wise man." "He was," I said softly. He truly was. What my grandfather taught me wasn't only chess. He taught me that truth matters, that documentation matters, that patience is a weapon. He taught me that sometimes the people you love most will betray you, but that doesn't mean you abandon justice. He taught me that you don't need to be loud to be strong. You You don't need confrontation to win. Sometimes the strongest move is the quiet one, the move no one sees coming. And most importantly, he taught me that even when everything seems hopeless, even when no one believes you, even when you are alone and trapped, you never quit. You write it down. You prepare. You wait. Because the truth is patient. Tonight, after the last customer leaves, I sit alone at the chess table. I push a pawn forward. Imagine his next move. Smile as I picture the way he would counter. My phone buzzes. An email from the bank. The final portion of the estate has been completed. The official amount in my account, $2,487,000. $2,487,000. But truly, he left me much more than that. He left me a lesson in integrity, in patience, in never letting bullies win. He left me a legacy. I look up at his photo. Sharp eyes, gentle smile. Thank you, I whisper, for believing in me, for choosing me. And I swear I hear his voice, low, warm, steady. You did very well, little Elise. You did very well. I turn off the lights, lock the door. Step out into the D.C. night. The sky still holds stars, even though city lights hide most of them. The air is cool, but not bitter. Spring is coming. I walk home through familiar streets, hands in my pockets, my heart lighter than it has been for the first time since he died. My grandfather spent the final 9 years of his life fighting a battle he could not win while he was alive, but he won it, through me. And now, every day when I open the bookstore, when I sit at that chess table, when I look at his photo and read his words, I remember the truth is patient. It can wait longer than any lie. And in the end, always, always, it wins. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to join me for the stories to come, about justice, about truth, and about the people who wait in silence until the day they are finally seen.